And sustained development and growth should strike a balance between the protection of the environment and economic growth. When fragile systems which provide clean water, clean air, and healthy soils are threatened, the impact on the environment will be disastrous, and we could be the victims of its fallout to our way of life. How should we protect our environment, especially the remaining virgin forest, from the greed of politicians, private business investments, which tend to collide with ancestral domains of our indigenous people? Joining us tonight on the line is Secretary Neri Acosta, a true champion in protecting our environment and presidential advisor on the environment and general manager of the LLDA. Good evening, sir.
Yes, good evening. Good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the studio. Such traffic on the way there.
Yes, sir. Sir, just to start us off, the President's commitment to protecting the environment is very strong. Given this commitment, what is your roadmap? Could you give us an idea of your list of priorities?
Well, you know, a 6-year term of a president is way too short if you look at all of the kind of challenges we face on the environmental front: water, air, solid waste management, forest, rivers, seas, coastal resources, etc. So we have to look at really in the next 3 years, 4 to 5 years, what we call low-hanging fruits, things that we could actually be able to do, those doables. And the doables have to do with addressing some of the climate change impacts that we are facing, especially in a metropolitan area like Manila and the Laguna Lake or the Calabarzon region. And so those low-hanging fruits would have to do with actually addressing flooding, for one, those impacts that really affect large segments or sections of our population, and also that really have much to do with economic dislocation, you know, impact on livelihood. So the low-hanging fruits would be like flooding control, the control of floods, and that really have to do also with the fact that we have to get people out of harm's way, or at least mitigate those. So the roadmap, if you ask me, would have to be very long. But if you look at the next 3, 4, 5 years, a medium-term period, it would really have to be addressing disaster risk and the issues of climate adaptation, especially for our metropolitan area of 20 million or so people. Then that would be flooding or the flood control. That's really a immediate short-term set of measures we have to do. And we're doing that with DPWH. We're doing that for river protection and rehabilitation, desilting and clogging of a lot of our waterways. That has to do also with solid waste management issues all over the 24 river basins of Laguna Lake, which impact obviously the National Capital Region. And we've seen that with Ondoy and with Habagat, and so that's why we're really working very hard with the DPWH on this.
So with regards to illegal logging and mining, these are major concerns, especially when it affects areas claimed by our indigenous people. What is your plan to ensure their ancestral rights or claims are not taken away from them?
Well, first of all, we were part of what the President assigned us to do, which is the Executive Order 79, the drafting and the crafting of that, the mining policy review. And the President signed that in June of this year. And then we proceeded in the Cabinet cluster on environment and climate change, and with the Mining Industry Coordinating Council, which was created out of EO 79, into looking at the implementing rules and regulations, primarily on no-go zones. And when we say no-go, that includes many sections of the archipelago that are not just protected areas, but also those fragile ecosystems in ancestral domain areas. And so if you ask me about the indigenous cultures, indigenous communities in many, many parts of the country, we seek to address that primarily, absent yet new legislation that have to do revisiting the Mining Act and revisiting the Rights Act, revisiting even the Agrarian Reform Act and land use, other such land use laws, then we have to really look at the no-go or the protected areas where and ancestral domains where we can define, and we're working that. In fact, I chair the technical working group on that, and the NCIP, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, also sits in that TWG, technical working group, to look and define with the NAMRIA, the mapping agency of government, into seeing where really these no-go zones are. I mean, you can't go in just to extract, whether mining or logging, because they are protected areas.
I guess that's really a very important issue, because most of our indigenous people still live in poverty and hardly benefit from the promise of politicians that the entry of investors in their areas will improve their way of life. What are the measures that are being undertaken right now to make sure that this doesn't happen, and that the way of life for our indigenous will actually be on the up and up?
Well, what we're looking at, in fact, is that it's not as if, in fact, it would be some of the indigenous groups and communities who will be the first to say that they're not exactly anti-development or anti-mining or anti-economic activity. What they seek and what we should really respect is the understanding that not that their cultures can remain pristine, uncontained or from any outside influence. We know that's too ideal if we look at it in those terms, but that the balance of ecology and economy, in fact, really happen or is clearly struck in these ancestral domain areas, as well as in the protected areas of our country where critical ecosystems are. And so what we really need is, in fact, programs where there is enough of the access to basic services, education, healthcare, for indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. Same time allow for sustainable livelihood and opportunities whereby there could still be an income stream for these communities, so that poverty also does not become the kind of curse that pushes some of these groups to succumb to luring the allure, so-called, of big money and big investments in their area. So it's really that kind of balance.
So could you give us an idea of what kind of programs should be provided, or livelihood programs for our indigenous peoples, especially the Manobos in Bukidnon and Agusan, to manage and protect their forests? What are the short-term and long-term programs for this?
Well, there are, in fact, let's say good practices, maybe not as many as we would like to see them all over the country with indigenous groups and areas, but at least we could see that there are templates, there are shining or good spots, should we say, where, for instance, I know I'm from Bukidnon, I'm from northern Mindanao, and we see that, for instance, if we can help define with private-public partnerships, and especially those from the global conservation and environment networks, where we can define a particular area, say 1,000, 2,000 hectares of protected forest, and those that overlap with ancestral domain, an investment can be made where you are, in effect, you earn more or are paid for, in fact, just protecting the forests. Where you see debt for nature swaps or arrangements, or where you have, in fact, an area that is defined as a reserve, and the indigenous peoples inside, for protecting that reserve, get more in terms of livelihood opportunities that do not touch or destroy the forest or the ecosystems. But there's already a fund, a pool for that. And then you link it with the market instruments, for instance, in terms of carbon credits, clean development mechanisms, which are coming out of all our what we talk about in climate change mitigation and adaptation worldwide. This has come out of the Kyoto Protocol, etc. You know, these international arrangements, and so we're looking into those because then you get credits for and you get economic benefits out of protecting and conserving tracts of forest instead of just cutting down those trees and earning from just the trees, the cut logs, and instead really see that the forests are protected and therefore that conservation pays more. Those are the new kinds of examples that we're looking at. We call them the clean development mechanism or mechanisms and the offsetting, you know, the carbon credits that we hear about. Yes.
So there's actually an executive order which provides that an alternative livelihood program be implemented for the indigenous people so that they have the incentive to fight illegal logging. What could this be? I understand that the Lobo tribe has started palm oil plantation in Agusan del Sur and somehow it's successful. Are you aware of it? And can this be a template for a bigger program if you think it could do good for our indigenous people?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm aware of that, and I know that in some other areas of the world, in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, or parts of Mindanao, there may be examples as such, but we all have to be just very careful that it's not as if you have an entire stretch or expanse of land that used to be forest converted into palm oil plantations just so that there's, you know, a more steady stream of economic activity and investment, but that in fact there may be what we call buffer zones or a more diversified land use scheme where it's not as if it's all contiguous forest converted into palm oil. I wouldn't agree with that personally, but there are areas, for instance, logged over areas where you can have palm oil or you can have fruit trees and orchards, but you always ensure that there's always shed catchment or an area where protected forests, indigenous species remain, because that is also the value of biodiversity. And so we're working with programs like Waves. No, Waves is wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services with the World Bank and other international bodies. I'm part of that, and we're trying to study how best we put a value to the forest, we put a value. So it's not just a palm oil plantation, period, but it's a mix. So that's what we're trying to also look at. And yes, it could work. Actually, it could. But we just have to be careful that it cannot, it will apply to each and every area or setting.
Okay, I wish we had more time to discuss it, but thank you. On that note, that was Secretary Neri Acosta, Presidential Advisor on the Environment. Thank you for joining us tonight, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.